Welcome to the Bluffton Biblecast, where together we dive into this week's Bible reading. Join us as we seek to understand the Word more fully, so we can live by it more faithfully. Thanks for listening in. I'm Rhonda Maller, and I am joined by Kim Meyer and Mike Lisey, with faithful Tiffany Tanner behind the soundboard. You know, I typically associate parables with Jesus in the New Testament. Truthfully, I didn't even know there was any in the Old Testament. But this week, we will be diving into the Old Testament, where God uses parables to teach His people. We begin in Judges. Take it away, Kim.
Thanks, Rhonda. Yeah, I totally agree. Old Testament parables did not go together for me. But let's start with some fun facts about Judges. There were 15 judges in Israel, and did you know that they did not all come from the same tribe? There were at least 8 tribes represented, and our reading this week comes from the only account that has a father-son succession.
Which would be Gideon and Abimelech, right?
Yeah, you're right. And we know the classic story of Gideon with the fleece and the Midianites, but that's not what we're going to be reading on Monday in chapter 9. Our focus will actually be on Abimelech. And honestly, I would suggest reading in Judges 8:22.
Why is that, Kim?
Well, it will give our readers a heartbeat of what's going on with God's people and set the stage for our parable that begins in chapter 9.
I agree. So Gideon, who is also known as Jerubbaal, dies and leaves, sit back and listen, 70 sons behind. Abimelech is one of them. And knowing the people wanted a leader, Abimelech goes to Shechem, where his mother was from, and asks them to support him as leader. He gains their support, and then he kills his 70 brothers. One brother managed to escape. That's Jotham.
Very gruesome but true, Rhonda. But after Abimelech is made king, Jotham goes to Mount Gerizim and proclaims a fable.
Wait a minute. Hold on, Kim. I thought we were talking about parables. What in the world's a fable?
You're right, Mike. We are talking about parables. But in the Bible, it called it Jotham's fable. And a fable is a story that typically uses animals to highlight human weaknesses or follies. And in this case, Jotham uses trees to reveal the errors of the Shechemites, Abimelech, and the process by which they made him king.
That's right, Kim. Jotham challenges the integrity of Shechem and Abimelech. Now, if they had acted in good faith, they have nothing to worry about. But if not, then they can expect destruction. And that's exactly what happens when you read the rest of chapter 9.
I find it interesting that Jotham spoke this fable from Mount Gerizim when Israel was coming into the promised land. They proclaimed blessings from Mount Gerizim and cursings from Mount Ebal. Jotham knew their wrongdoing, so why didn't he speak his fable from Mount Ebal to emphasize their doing wrong?
Good question, Mike. And one thought is that by Jotham speaking the fable from Mount Gerizim reveals God's desire to show His people hope and redemption, despite their mistakes.
Great thought, Rhonda. To close this story, I'd like to transform Jotham's fable into a parable. The olive tree, fig tree, and vine knew their talents and purpose, and they were not swayed to be anything else. We as God's children need to know our talents and purpose. If we know this, our hearts won't be drawn away either, no matter how enticing the offer may look.
In our second readings in 2 Samuel, God uses parables to reach the heart of David. God loved David, calling him a man after His own heart. Yet, in His love for him, God could not leave sin unaddressed.
That's right. David had lusted after Bathsheba and committed adultery. Even when he received news of a coming baby, David sought to hide his sin with more sin, rather than have a repentant spirit.
And 7 to 8 months later, at his son's birth, David had not yet acknowledged and repented of his obvious sin. It's interesting to note that David's harp was silent during this time, indicating that his soul was not at rest or in communion with his Lord. And it was at this point that God sent Nathan the prophet with a parable for David.
As we read, Nathan shared the story of a wealthy man who owned many flocks of sheep and a poor neighbor who only had one sheep, whom he loved and cared for as a child. But when the wealthy man had a visitor, he spared his abundant flock, took the poor man's only lamb, killed it, and prepared it for his guest.
It is so human to be blind to our own sin, and like we have all been guilty of, David was wroth with anger, demanding that the wealthy man who had committed such a deed be put to death.
You're right, Mike. We are so blind to ourselves sometimes. And then he hears the prophet respond, "You are that man."
Faced with the truth, David confesses his sin and repents. Though he would suffer consequences, a sword would never leave his house. He would face adversity from within his home, and his wives would be given openly to others. However, God forgave David and spared him his life.
3 years later, these consequences would again have God sending someone with the parable to help David make the right decision. David's son, Absalom, had killed his half-brother, Amnon, to avenge the grave wrong that Amnon had committed against Tamar, a full sister to Absalom, but only half to Amnon. Consequently, David banned Absalom from Jerusalem.
But Joab knew the heart of David and his yearning for his son. He spoke to a woman in Tekoa, known for her wisdom, and sent her to David, telling her how to dress and what to say.
That's right, Mike. The woman told a story, or parable, to David about how her 2 sons had fought, and one had killed the other. Now her relatives and friends wanted to kill the second son to avenge the death of the first, but this would leave her with no sons. David told the woman she could go home, and he would ensure her son would be saved.
And that leads right into God's parable. The woman then turned the story upon David and asked why he was doing the same thing to Israel that the avengers wanted to do to her son. David realizes his actions and removes the ban on Absalom, bringing him home.
On the one hand, God is holy, and he cannot abide or ignore sin. But on the other hand, God in his tender mercy, loving kindness, and grace doesn't give up on us, but always provides a way of escape.
And he keeps his promises. In 2 Kings 20, when God answers Hezekiah's prayer, he remembers his promise to David, telling Hezekiah that he will add 15 years to his life, rescue him from the king of Assyria, and defend the city for God's honor, and for the sake of his servant David. Our Friday's Bible reading this week is recorded in Isaiah 5. It is an Old Testament parable that in my Bible is titled God's Disappointing Vineyard. The first stanza, verses 1 and 2, is about God's care for his vineyard and his expectation that it would yield good grapes.
You know, the first stanza sounds really optimistic, but the title lets me know that there's some more to come. The vineyard is God's chosen people, the nation of Israel, and the owner is God himself. You know, various study Bibles indicate that God, through the prophet Isaiah, is revealing his heart toward his beloved Israel.
You're right, Kim. This is pretty amazing stuff. You know, Rhonda mentioned it in the opening, but I'll say it again. It has never dawned on me that God used parables in the Old Testament like Jesus did in the New Testament.
I thought the same thing, Mike.
In this parable, the owner, or God, made every conceivable provision for the vine's productivity and protection. This illustrates the Lord's purely gracious choice of Israel as his chosen people.
So justifiably, he expected a good yield from his investment. But the second stanza, verses 3 through 6, expresses God's disappointment when the vineyard fails to yield good fruit.
Right, Kim. Despite all the work done regarding the vineyard, it brought forth wild grapes, sour berries, inedible, and fit only for dumping. In verse 4, we can picture the Lord throwing up his hands and exclaiming, "There's nothing more I can do." As is obvious, there is now a change in the message.
Good point, Mike. The style now becomes very abrupt. The tone is fierce and menacing. Consequently, the Lord did exactly what he said he would do during the time of Nebuchadnezzar, and then in AD 70. All this came to pass, and in most horrifying detail.
It's believed that the rain spoken of in verse 6 concerns spiritual renewal. Since Israel's rejection of Christ, there has been no spiritual rain in any capacity, and she has brought forth briars and thorns in a spiritual sense.
It will be a full week as we dig into various parables or word pictures and genealogy in the Old Testament. In fact, as we prepared for the podcast, we learned more about Abimelech, Jotham, David, Nathan, and Hezekiah, and we know you will too.
You might even feel overwhelmed with all this information, but remember the purpose of parables and be open to what the Spirit wants to teach you. We encourage all of you to keep reading and keep digging for those pearls of great value. Podcast listeners, have a joyous week.